My father's company collapsed in 6 weeks without me. He called it the rough patch. I called it a demonstration. I want to tell you about the specific weight of being indispensable to people who have convinced themselves you are replaceable. It has a texture unlike any other kind of invisibility because it requires a particular combination of circumstances to sustain itself. You have to be doing enough that nothing works without you, while being overlooked enough that nobody credits you for what works. It's a balance that, once you understand it clearly, can only be maintained by one party's continued willingness to accept it. The moment you stop accepting it, the whole construction collapses. I stopped accepting it on a Tuesday afternoon in September, in a conference room on the third floor of Holt and Associates, when my father looked across a table at a man who had been employed by our company for exactly 5 weeks and told him he was being promoted to operations director. The man's name was Brandon Calloway. He was 34, confident in the unearned way of someone who has always moved through rooms expecting them to rearrange around him, and he was married to my sister Diane, which was the only qualification that mattered in a room where my father was making the decisions. Brandon had spent his career in sales, not operations, not logistics, not the complex, relationship-dependent architecture of supply chain management that Holt and Associates had been built on over 22 years. He'd spent 5 weeks at the company sitting in meetings and asking questions that revealed, to anyone paying attention, that he did not yet understand the difference between a vendor contract and a vendor relationship. He dressed well. He spoke confidently. He shook hands with the grip of a man who has been told his handshake is an asset. My father adored him. My name is Mara Chen. I'm 29 years old. My mother is my father's second wife. He had Diane with his first, which means I grew up in the particular configuration of a blended family, where the lines of belonging were never quite as clean as everyone publicly insisted they were. I don't say this to set up a victimhood narrative, because I've spent enough time examining my own patterns to know that self-pity is not a useful operating mode and doesn't produce good outcomes. I say it because it's context. Because understanding what happened at Holt and Associates requires understanding the room I walked into when I joined the company 3 years before the Tuesday in September, and the room I walked into was one where certain assumptions about certain people had been in place for a very long time before I arrived. My father, Richard Holt, started the company when I was 4 years old. Supply chain consulting, an unglamorous, essential, extremely technical field that requires the kind of sustained attention to operational detail that most people find either deeply satisfying or quietly soul-destroying, depending on their nature. My nature found it deeply satisfying, which is how I came to be working there at all. I had spent my early 20s in a larger firm, learning the field from people who treated it with the rigor it deserved, and when I was 26, my father asked if I'd consider bringing that expertise in-house. The company had grown faster than its internal systems could keep up with. He needed someone who could build those systems and maintain them. He knew I was good at it. He asked. I said yes because I loved my father and believed in what he'd built and thought, with the particular optimism of a 26-year-old who has not yet learned all the ways that institutional loyalty can be exploited, that contributing to something that shared my name, well, his name, but the name I'd grown up around, would be meaningful in a way that a large impersonal firm couldn't be. I was not wrong about it being meaningful. I was wrong about what meaning would cost. In 3 years at Holt and Associates, I rebuilt the company's vendor management system from the ground up. This is not an overstatement. When I arrived, vendor relationships were maintained through a combination of spreadsheets that hadn't been updated consistently since 2019, a shared email inbox that 7 people had access to and nobody was clearly responsible for, and the individual memory of a woman named Gloria, who had been with the company for 15 years and who held in her head an extraordinary amount of institutional knowledge that existed nowhere else. Gloria was 63 and planning to retire. The knowledge in her head was, to put it gently, not transferable by conventional means and was definitely going to leave with her. I built the system. I documented everything Gloria knew in a format that could be searched, updated, and trained on. I rebuilt the client communication workflow so that nothing fell through a gap between departments. I established the vendor review cycle that saved the company approximately $40,000 in the first year by identifying contracts where we were consistently paying above market rate for services we'd stopped using at full capacity. I designed the onboarding protocol for new clients that took a process which had previously taken 3 weeks of confused back and forth and compressed it into 7 days of structured clarity. I created the project tracking methodology that our operations team now ran everything through, which meant that at any given moment anyone could see exactly where any engagement stood without having to call 3 people and wait 2 days for an answer. I did all of this without being given a title that reflected it. I was a senior operations coordinator, not a director, not even a manager. Technically, though, I was managing, in the real sense of the word, the sense that means making decisions that affected how the whole company ran every day. I'd raised this twice with my father. The first time, 18 months in, he'd said he wanted to wait until the end of the fiscal year and reassess. The second time, 6 months after that, he'd said he needed to think about the org chart holistically before making any structural changes. Both conversations had the quality of a door being held mostly closed while appearing to be open, and I had been, each time, too committed to the work to press it further than he was willing to go. In retrospect, this patience was the mistake. Not a moral mistake. I think patience with the work itself is always right, but a strategic one. Because patience, in an environment where your contributions are invisible by design, is easily mistaken for contentment. If I was doing the work and not making noise about what I wasn't being given for it, the simplest interpretation available was that I was fine with the arrangement. I was not fine with the arrangement, but I was doing the work anyway, which sent a signal I didn't intend to send. Brandon joined the company in early August. He joined because Diane had been lobbying my father for months to give him a role. Brandon's previous sales position had ended in a way that was diplomatically described as a mutual decision, and which I understood, from things Diane had said in unguarded moments, to have been less mutual than the description suggested. My father had a blind spot about Diane that he didn't have about me, which is simply a fact of their particular relationship and not something I've spent much energy resenting, because resentment about things you cannot change is rent paid on property you don't own. Brandon came in as a senior business development associate, which was a title my father had invented for the occasion and which meant, in practice, that Brandon attended meetings and met clients and did the visible, relationship-facing work that photographs well and is easy to describe at dinner parties.
He was good at this part.
He was genuinely good at it. Brandon could walk into a room of strangers and leave 40 minutes later with everyone feeling as though they'd known him for years. That's a skill. I'm not dismissive of it. I'm only noting that it is a different skill from the one required to run operations at a supply chain consulting firm, and that my father, who had spent 22 years building a company on the unglamorous, essential work, appeared to have forgotten this in the specific way people forget inconvenient things when they very much want something else to be true. I found out about the promotion the way I found out about most things at Holt and Associates that affected me significantly, not from my father directly, but from the ecosystem around him. In this case, it was my colleague Jess, who sat close enough to the glass-walled conference room on the second floor to observe and occasionally lip-read conversations she was not party to. Jess told me on a Monday that she'd seen my father and Brandon in what looked like a serious discussion involving the whiteboard and the organizational chart that was normally kept rolled up in the cabinet. She hadn't been certain what she was seeing. She wanted me to know. I went to my father on Tuesday morning and asked him directly if there was a structural change coming. He said there was and that he'd wanted to talk to me about it and that he'd been planning to do so at the end of the week, but since I was asking, and then he told me, Brandon was being promoted to operations director. I would continue in my current role, reporting to Brandon. He said this in the measured, apologetic but not apologizing tone of a man who has made a decision he knows is indefensible and has prepared a defense for it anyway. He said Brandon brought an important client-facing energy to the operations role. He said the company needed someone who could bridge the business development and operational sides. He said he believed the structure would allow me to do what I did best without the burden of the additional responsibilities the directorship would bring. He said several other things in the same register, each one carefully constructed to sound like a consideration of my well-being that was actually a justification of his preference, and I sat across from him and listened to all of it with the face I wear when I am receiving information I need to process before I respond. When he finished, I said, I need to think about this. He said he understood. I went back to my desk. I sat in my chair for 22 minutes, which I know because I looked at the clock when I sat down and again when I stood up, and in those 22 minutes I did the thing I do when a large decision is required. I identified what I actually wanted versus what the situation was pressuring me to want. What the situation was pressuring me to want was for my father to reconsider, to see what he'd done, to correct it. What I actually wanted was for my work to be valued on its merits by people capable of valuing it, in an environment where merit was the operative measure. These two things are different. The first is about this specific situation. The second is about the rest of my career. And you can only have the second if you're willing to let go of the first. I stood up. I walked to my father's office. I knocked. He said, "Come in," with the voice of a man who expected this to be a continuation of the earlier conversation, more negotiation, more processing, the familiar rhythms of a daughter who would ultimately accept what had been decided. I put my resignation letter on his desk.
He looked at it. He looked at me.
He said my name in the voice parents use when a child has done something that surprises them so completely they forget to have a prepared response. I told him it was effective immediately. I said I had a standard 2-week notice that I was prepared to serve, but that given the circumstances, specifically that I would be reporting to a man I'd just learned about 40 minutes ago and in whom I had no professional confidence, I thought it was cleaner for everyone if I left today. I told him I'd be happy to answer questions remotely for a limited period, that I'd document everything I could in the next few hours and leave it organized, and that I wished him and the company genuine success. He said a great many things after that. I listened to enough of them to confirm they were variations on the same core message, which was, "Don't be rash, let's discuss this. You're making a permanent decision based on a temporary reaction." I told him, calmly, that I didn't think it was rash, that I'd been thinking about it for 22 minutes, and that 22 minutes was enough time to know. Which was true in the way that 22 minutes sometimes is, not because the decision is simple, but because you've been doing the math for a long time without acknowledging you were doing it, and the 22 minutes is just when you finally wrote down the answer. I packed my desk into 2 boxes. Jess watched me do it with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to intervene and concluding correctly that intervention was not what the moment called for. She asked, quietly, if I was okay. I told her yes, and I meant it, which surprised me. I had expected to feel worse than I did. What I felt was a version of the clean, quiet clarity I'd felt in other moments of large, irrevocable decision, which is its own evidence that the decision is right. Wrong decisions feel like the floor is unstable. Right ones feel like you've just stepped onto something solid you didn't know was there. I carried my boxes out. I said goodbye to the people I liked. I got in my car. I drove home. Let me tell you what happened at Holt & Associates in the 6 weeks after I left, because this is the part people always want to hear, and because understanding it requires understanding what I had been doing that nobody had been able to see I was doing. The vendor management system I'd built over 3 years was, in the technical sense, fully documented. I'd created guides, process maps, protocols, the whole infrastructure of institutional knowledge that I'd been so diligent about building precisely because I'd watched what happened when it lived only in Gloria's head. The documentation was there. What the documentation could not contain was the judgment, the accumulated context, the 3 years of specific relational knowledge that determines when you call a vendor instead of emailing them, when a client silence means everything is fine versus when it means something is quietly wrong, when a delay in the procurement cycle will cascade into a problem 3 weeks from now versus when it's an anomaly that resolves itself. This kind of knowledge is not documented because it cannot be. It exists in the person who has been paying attention, and when the person leaves, it leaves with them. Brandon Calloway discovered this approximately 8 days after I resigned. He discovered it because the first thing he did, with the confidence of a man who has been told he is now in charge of something, was restructure the vendor communication protocol. He didn't like the system I'd built. It was, he told Jess, too complicated, too process-heavy, not agile enough for a company at our stage of growth. He streamlined it, by which he meant he simplified it in the ways that make things look simpler without making them actually simpler, which is the most dangerous kind of simplification because it removes the redundancies that exist for reasons that aren't visible until the redundancy is gone, and the reason becomes a crisis. The first vendor issue surfaced in week 2. A materials supplier we'd been working with for 7 years, a company called Alderton Industrial, with whom I had a specific, carefully managed relationship built on the understanding that their account manager, a woman named Patricia Rue, needed to be contacted directly for anything time-sensitive rather than through the general inbox. Sent a formal notice of non-renewal on a contract that should have been in the middle of routine renegotiation. Patricia had emailed the general inbox twice. The emails had sat there. Nobody had flagged them because nobody had known to flag them. In the system I'd built, Patricia's account had a tag that routed her communications to me directly regardless of where they originated. In Brandon's streamlined system, that tag no longer existed. The Alderton contract was not catastrophic in itself. What it was a harbinger. Because the same pattern repeated itself in week 3 with 2 client accounts whose quarterly check-in calls had been in my calendar and nowhere else. Calls I'd been conducting as a matter of relationship maintenance, not as a formal deliverable, which meant they weren't in any system Brandon could look at and identify. The clients didn't send an angry email. They just went quiet in the way that clients go quiet when they are beginning to have a conversation with someone else. My father noticed when one of them, a mid-sized manufacturer we'd been working with for 4 years, declined to renew their retainer in a terse email that cited exploring other options, without further specification. Week 4 brought the internal chaos, which was the part I'd been expecting and which was, in some ways, the most clarifying. The project tracking methodology I designed, the one that told anyone at any moment exactly where any engagement stood, required consistent input from across the team to function. Brandon had not made this a priority in his first weeks, partly because he didn't fully understand why it mattered and partly because, being new to the operations role, he didn't know what he didn't know about what he was failing to maintain. By week 4, the tracking board was 3 weeks out of date on 11 different engagements. The operations team was spending 40% of its time in status meetings trying to reconstruct information that should have been visible at a glance. 2 project managers were duplicating work on separate tracks without knowing the other existed. A new client engagement had been promised a deliverable timeline that was, as a matter of simple logistics, not achievable given current capacity, because whoever had made the promise had not checked the capacity tracker, because the capacity tracker was one of the 11 things that was 3 weeks out of date. I know all of this because Jess told me. Jess texted me with updates approximately every other day with the faithful consistency of a correspondent in a war zone, and while I want to be clear that I did not encourage this or ask for it, I also did not tell her to stop because I am human and the information was relevant to decisions I had not yet finished making. My father called me for the first time at the end of week 3. He said he wanted to check in to see how I was doing to maintain the relationship. It was a call dressed as a personal call that was actually a professional one, and I received it as what it was. I told him I was well. I told him I was consulting independently, which was true. I'd picked up 2 small clients in the weeks since leaving, because supply chain expertise is not something that sits idle when you offer it on the open market. I asked about the company with the genuine interest of someone who had built things there that she still cared about. He said everything was going well, which I knew from Jess was not precisely accurate, but I received it without comment, and we said goodbye warmly. He called again at the end of week 4. This call was less dressed up. He said there were some operational challenges he was working through and that he'd appreciated my systems, and he wondered if I might be available for a limited consulting engagement to help Brandon get up to speed. I told him I'd need to think about it. He said of course. The call was shorter. He called a 3rd time at the beginning of week 6. This call was not dressed up at all. It was the call of a man who has run out of diplomatic framing and has arrived at the place where honesty is the only remaining option. He said, "Mara, the company needs you back. I made a mistake and I need to know if there's a path forward." I want to tell you what I felt when he said this because I think it matters to the story and because the honest answer is not what you might expect. I didn't feel triumphant. I'd been waiting for this call. I'd known, with a professional certainty that had nothing to do with ego, that the call would come, but receiving it was not the satisfaction I'd imagined in abstract. It was something quieter, more like relief, actually mixed with something that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it. Relief that the reality had finally surfaced into a form that could be addressed. Something grief-adjacent about what it had taken to get here, that my father had needed 6 weeks of operational collapse to see what 3 years of reliable competence hadn't shown him. But I didn't let those feelings determine my response, because the feelings were information and the response was a decision, and decisions made from feeling tend to resolve the feeling in the short term while producing outcomes that are worse in the long term. I told my father I would consider returning, but that I needed him to understand that the terms of my return would be fundamentally different from the terms under which I'd worked before.
He said he was open to that.
I said I needed more than open. I needed a meeting, with him and Brandon both present, in which the actual state of the company's operations was put on the table plainly. I wasn't willing to return to the previous arrangement of my work being invisible to the people it served. I said if we were going to do this, we were going to do it in a way where what I contributed and what I required in return were mutually understood and formally structured. My father agreed. He said he'd set up the meeting. He asked when I was available. I told him Thursday. I spent Wednesday preparing for Thursday with the same focused attention I'd brought to building the vendor management system 3 years earlier. I pulled together documentation, not all of it, not comprehensively, but a targeted selection designed to make one thing legible: the gap between what the company had been doing while I was there and what it had been doing in the 6 weeks since. I prepared a current state operational assessment based on what Jess had shared with me plus what could be inferred from publicly available information. The vendor notice from Alderton had been filed in a way that created a paper trail I had access to. The client who declined to renew had, in their terse email, copied me on an old thread, which gave me context. I prepared a future state proposal. I prepared a title structure. I prepared a compensation structure. I prepared, in short, the meeting that should have happened 3 years earlier, before I'd spent 3 years doing work that had never been formally acknowledged. I dressed for Thursday the way I dress when I need the external to support the internal, not performatively, not as armor, but as the particular act of self-possession that comes from deciding to take yourself seriously in a room where others may not. I drove to the office I'd left 6 weeks earlier. Jess saw me come through the front door and gave me a look that contained approximately 17 different things, of which the most prominent were relief and something that looked like vicarious satisfaction. I nodded at her. I went to the conference room on the 3rd floor. My father was there. Brandon was there. Brandon looked the way people look when they've been having a very hard 6 weeks and know that the meeting they're about to sit in is going to require them to acknowledge that, which is to say he looked the specific combination of defensive and exhausted that is the signature of a person who has discovered, at some cost, that confidence and competence are not the same thing. I sat down. I put my materials on the table. My father said it was good to see me, and I said it was good to see him, and both of these things were true in the complicated way that true things often are. I opened the meeting by saying I wanted to start with a current state picture before we talked about anything else. I said I'd prepared a brief operational assessment, and I'd like to walk them through it. My father nodded. Brandon nodded with the slightly rigid quality of someone who has been briefed that this meeting is important and should be approached with humility, and who is working to perform humility while also feeling defensive about the circumstances that require it. I walked them through the assessment. I did this without drama and without "I told you so" energy, because neither of those things were useful and both would have undermined the actual purpose of the meeting. I spoke in the language of the work itself: vendor relationship status, client account health, project tracking coverage, capacity utilization, the specific places where the 6-week gap had created problems that would take time to repair. I showed them the Alderton situation. I showed them the client who hadn't renewed. I showed them the project tracking board as it currently stood versus how it had been maintained previously. I showed them the capacity discrepancy that had produced an untenable deliverable promise. I showed them all of this with the even, professional clarity of someone who is not making a personal argument but presenting factual information, and I watched their faces as the factual information landed. My father's face, as I spoke, did something I had not seen it do in the 3 years I'd worked for him. It went through the specific sequence of a person who is genuinely learning something they should have already known, not the polite performance of learning, which is what people do in meetings when they want to appear open, but the actual thing, the visible revision of an internal picture, the slight compression around the eyes and mouth of someone whose model of reality is updating in real time. He had believed, I think, that the operations I'd built were robust enough to outlast my departure, that the systems would carry themselves without the person who'd built them. He had believed this because I'd been so diligent about documenting everything, and because it is comfortable to believe that people are replaceable when the alternative belief requires you to pay them accordingly. He was finding out in a conference room on a Thursday morning that this belief had been wrong. Brandon was harder to read, because Brandon is a man whose social fluency includes the ability to maintain a composed exterior while whatever is happening inside remains inaccessible from the surface. But there was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when I was going through the vendor relationship component, and I mentioned the specific institutional knowledge involved in managing the top 12 suppliers, the particular history with each, the relational nuances, the things that were nowhere in the documentation because they couldn't be, and something in his expression shifted in a way that told me he understood, finally, what he had been trying to run without knowing he didn't know how to run it. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something more honest than that. The recognition of a man who has spent 6 weeks trying to hold something together while privately suspecting that the reason it keeps coming apart is not the previous person's failure to document clearly enough, but his own failure to understand what he was dealing with. When I finished the assessment, my father said, "What do you need to come back? Not what would it take. Not what can we work out. What do you need?" The specific humility of a question that frames the person being asked as the authority on the answer, which was the right frame, which was the frame that should have been applied years earlier but which I received now without the resentment that receiving it too late might have warranted. Because resentment about the past is useful for about 48 hours after the injustice and not useful after that. I told him what I needed. Director of Operations. The title that had just been given to Brandon, yes, and I want to tell you how I handled this piece, because it's the part that required the most thought, and that I'm most deliberate about describing accurately. I did not ask my father to take the title back from Brandon. I asked my father to restructure the reporting line so that operations reported to me and Brandon's role shifted to what it was actually suited to, which was client relationship management, the visible, people-facing work he was genuinely good at. I framed this not as punishment for Brandon, but as the correct organizational structure for the company's needs, which it also genuinely was. A good client-facing operator and a good operational director serve different functions, and both matter. The mistake had not been hiring Brandon. The mistake had been misaligning his strengths with a role they didn't fit, which was something my father had done, and which could be corrected without anyone having to lose face in the way that zero-sum corrections require. I asked for a compensation structure that reflected the directorship, a specific number I'd researched, and arrived at based on market rate for the role and responsibility level, plus an equity arrangement I'd consulted a lawyer about in the week before the meeting. I laid this out without apology and without softening it into a request, because it was not a request. It was a structure. I was telling them what a sustainable working arrangement looked like, not asking them to consider whether it might be possible. I asked for clarity of authority, a formal scope of my decision-making power in the operational domain, so that the thing that had made my work invisible before, which was that it had all happened through informal influence rather than formal structure, would be replaced by something documented and understood. I had spent 3 years being the person everyone came to for operational decisions while holding a title that said Senior Coordinator. I was not going to return to that arrangement. The authority I had been exercising in practice needed to be made legible in structure. My father listened to all of this. When I finished, he didn't try to negotiate any of it immediately, which was the right response and also, I think, an accurate reflection of the fact that he knew, sitting in that room with the operational assessment still on the table, that he wasn't in a position to negotiate. Not because I had leverage in the adversarial sense. I wasn't threatening, I was simply being clear, but because the assessment had made the cost of not agreeing visible in a way that an absence of drama had made invisible for 3 years. He said, "Yes. All of it. When can you start?" I said Monday. Brandon said very little during the main part of the meeting. When it was over and my father had stepped out to handle a call, Brandon and I sat at the table for a few minutes, and I want to be accurate about what that conversation was, because I think it would be easy to describe it with a satisfaction I didn't actually feel. Brandon looked at me and said, "I was in over my head." He said it flatly, without self-pity. Just a factual statement. A man arriving at an acknowledgement that had taken 6 weeks of hard evidence to reach. I told him he was good at the client relationship piece. I said this because it was true, not because I was managing him, and I think he could tell the difference. I said the company genuinely needed someone in that role who could do what he did, and that I thought the restructured configuration could actually work if we were both clear about what each of us was there to do.
He nodded. He said he appreciated that.
There wasn't warmth in the exchange, exactly. We weren't going to become friends, and the 6 weeks and the circumstances between us didn't dissolve in a single conversation. But there was something that felt like the beginning of a functional working relationship, which was the outcome that served the company and, by extension, served me. I started the following Monday. The first week back was the kind of week that requires a particular combination of surgical precision and deliberate patience. The systems had deteriorated in specific ways that needed to be addressed in a specific order, and rushing the repair in a way that made the disorder visible as disorder would have been less useful than rebuilding quietly and letting the restored function speak for itself. I contacted Patricia Rue at Alderton first. I had a relationship with Patricia that predated the crisis by 3 years, and relationships survive organizational turbulence more reliably than systems do when the relationship has been maintained properly. She was professional and not warm, which was appropriate given what had happened with a contract non-renewal, but she was open, and we had a conversation that I believe had the shape of something salvageable, which was more than the situation had looked like from the outside. The client who'd gone quiet, the mid-sized manufacturer whose retainer had lapsed, I called personally. Not on behalf of the company, exactly, but on behalf of the working relationship we'd had, which had been built on my attention to their specific operational needs, and which they'd noticed when my attention was no longer present. The contact there was a woman named Sandra Mbui, who had been my main point of contact, and who answered the phone with the polite wariness of someone who is waiting to see what the call is actually about. I told her, honestly, that there had been a period of organizational disruption, that I was back and in a directorial capacity, and that I wanted to understand what their current needs were before I asked anything of them. Sandra talked to me for 40 minutes. She told me what the 6 weeks had looked like from their side. I listened without defending the company or minimizing what she described. At the end of the call, she said she'd be willing to have a formal meeting in the following week about what a renewed engagement might look like. We got them back. It took 3 more conversations and a revised scope document that I wrote specifically for their situation, but we got them back. I want to tell you about this not because it's the most dramatic part of the story, it isn't, but because I think it illustrates the thing about operational work that is hardest to make visible, which is that the best of it is invisible when it's working. The crisis becomes legible. The recovery is just the return to the normal state where nobody is paying attention because nothing is wrong. By week 4 of my return, the tracking board was current on every engagement. The vendor communication protocol had been rebuilt with the relational tags that Brandon Simplification had removed, plus several improvements I'd been thinking about for months. A new client onboarding that came in during my 2nd week went through the full protocol in 6 days, which was our target, and the client's feedback at the end of the onboarding was that they'd found the process unusually clear and well-managed. My father sent me a text about that feedback, just the client's words and a screenshot, no comment from him, which I understood as his version of recognition, arriving through the least direct path available to him, which was also the most he knew how to do, and I received it as what it was. The title change happened on a Friday, announced formally to the full team in an all-hands meeting that my father ran and that I attended without having scripted. He said my name with a quality I hadn't heard from him before. Not exactly pride, though that was in it, but more specifically the quality of a man publicly correcting an error and meaning the correction. He said I was being formally named Director of Operations, that this reflected a role I had been performing for 3 years, and that should have been recognized formally long before now. He said the last part specifically should have been recognized formally long before now. Without prompting, without me having asked him to say it, in front of the full team, including Brandon, including Jess, including the project managers and the administrative staff and the consultants who had all, in their various ways, watched the 6-week collapse, and were watching this with the focused attention of people who understand that what is being said is more than a title change. Jess cried a little. She was subtle about it, but I saw. I want to tell you about the 3 months since, because the story doesn't end at the title change, and I think ending it there would give a false picture of what this kind of thing actually produces. What it produces is not a transformed situation. It's a clarified one. The relationships in that office are not different in kind from what they were. My father is still my father, still a man whose blind spots run in specific directions, still someone who will default to the comfortable interpretation when the accurate one is harder. Brandon is still Brandon, still best suited to the client-facing work, still occasionally inclined toward the confident-sounding observation that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The company is still a mid-sized supply chain consulting firm with all the challenges that come with that size and that market. What's different is the structure. The structure now reflects the reality of what I do and what it's worth, and that structural clarity changes the texture of the daily work in ways that are small and pervasive and significant. When I make a decision about a vendor contract, I make it with the authority that decision requires, and no one has to wonder whether I had permission to make it. When a client issue comes to me, it comes to me as the director, not as a coordinator whom everyone knew to find but whose authority was technically lateral to the problem. When I present in a meeting, I present from a seat at the head of the table, which is where the meeting's operational decisions live, and the room's orientation to that fact has changed in the way that rooms change when the actual structure of power is made honest. My father and I have dinner occasionally, just the two of us. He doesn't talk about the 6 weeks directly. That's not how he processes things, and I've stopped expecting him to narrate his own growth in a way that satisfies my desire for his acknowledgement to be explicit. What he does is listen differently. When I talk about the company's operational direction, he asks questions that he didn't used to ask, that couldn't have come from anywhere but a recognition that he doesn't know things I know, and that this gap has consequences. The questions are the acknowledgement, even if the word sorry never arrives in the form I might once have wanted it. I told Frances about all of this in our session last month. She listened to the whole arc. The resignation, the 6 weeks, the meeting, the return, the 3 months since, and when I finished she sat with it for a moment, the way she does when she's thinking about what's actually useful to say rather than what is reflexively available. "What do you think you were trying to prove?" she said. I thought about the question carefully, which is the right way to approach Frances's questions, because the first available answer is rarely the accurate one. "Not anything to anyone else," I said after a while. "I think I was trying to make something legible. The work was always real. I needed it to be visible in the same way it was real. And is it now?" I thought about the tracking board current on every engagement. Patricia Rue's account, tagged and routed correctly. Sandra Mbuyi's 4-year retainer, renewed for another 2. Jess at her desk outside the conference room, doing her job in the particular settled way of someone who works in a place that is functioning correctly and knows the difference from when it isn't. "Yes," I said. "It is." Frances nodded. "How does that feel?" And here is the honest answer, the one I've been sitting with ever since. It feels like what I always thought it would feel like, which is not triumphant, not vindicated in any electric or satisfying way. It feels like standing on something solid. It feels like the particular satisfaction of a system that is working correctly, which is, and this is the thing about loving operational work, the thing that makes it worth 3 years of invisibility and 6 weeks of structured demonstration, a quiet, thorough, reliable feeling that doesn't require an audience. The work was always real. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. It just needs to be seen. That's all it ever needed. Update, posted 8 weeks later. A few things people have asked about, answered here because they keep coming up. Brandon. We have a functional working relationship. He is genuinely good with clients and he knows it now in a way he didn't when he arrived, which is to say he knows it in the context of understanding what he's not good at, which makes the thing he is good at more clearly valuable rather than generically self-evident. We are not close. We are professional. This is the correct outcome. Gloria, the woman who retired and whose institutional knowledge I'd spent my first 18 months documenting. I called her when I got back. Told her the system had held up through a stress test. She said she knew it would. She also said she'd heard about the 6 weeks because people who have spent 15 years somewhere maintain networks even in retirement, and she said, "I hope he learned something." I told her I thought he had. She said good. That was enough. My sister Diane and I have not discussed any of this directly. This is not a dramatic silence. It's just the particular tact that families apply when something happened that everyone understands and nobody is ready to excavate. She texted me when I rejoined the company, a single emoji that I interpreted as genuine and did not require more of. I texted back, "We will, eventually, have a conversation that is more than that. We're not there yet. Families move slowly, and I've made my peace with slowly. The salary and equity arrangement are in place. My lawyer reviewed the final documents before I signed them. They are, as she described them, solid. I bought myself good coffee equipment last week. Nothing dramatic, just a grinder and a proper kettle and beans from a roaster I've been meaning to try for a year and kept not getting around to. I made coffee on Saturday morning in my apartment, in the early light, with nowhere to be for 3 hours, and I drank it standing at the window looking at the street.
It was an ordinary Saturday.
I've been having a lot of those lately. They feel I've decided exactly right.